50. Adelaide Crane looked at me the way you'd look at something the lake spits up onto your dock after a bad October blow, debris that somebody is eventually going to have to deal with. Then she said the thing I've only ever repeated to 2 or 3 people, because nobody believes a woman like that would say it out loud. Get my husband's launch running again, Mr. Lachance, and I'll think about letting you sit at the table the day my daughter comes home. The proper sort stopped calling on Sylvie a long while ago. She didn't smile. There was no joke buried in it for me to be a good sport about. She was 76 years old, standing on the cut-stone steps of a boathouse that was bigger than the house I grew up in a cream linen jacket that cost more than my truck, looking down at a 51-year-old man in work pants with 2 days of mahogany dust ground into the creases of his hands. It was meant to put me in a box and nail the lid before I'd taken one step out of it, and what she had no way of knowing, what made the whole thing land in a place she never aimed at, was that I'd been standing on that exact dock as a boy, more than 40 years before, handing my father his tools. I should have got back in the truck. I had every reason to. But I took the job, and 3 weeks later, deep in the bilge of a boat that hadn't turned over since the spring her husband died, I found the one small thing that 4 better-paid men than me had all looked straight past. And what was tucked in beside it cracked open a family that had been sealed shut for the better part of 20 years. It cracked something open in me too, which I didn't see coming and didn't think I needed. Before I tell you what was hidden under that engine box, do me one small favor. If you've ever had somebody size you up in about 4 seconds, your truck, your boots, your hands, and decide right then exactly what you were worth, and you've gone and proved them dead wrong with nothing but the work, then hit subscribe. This whole channel's for guys like us, the ones who'd rather let the work speak and keep our mouths shut while everybody else does it the other way around. Go on, I'll be right here. My name's Wes Lachance. I'm 51. I fix wooden boats, the old ones, the ones most shops won't touch anymore because there's no money in it and the knowledge is dying out faster than anybody's writing it down. Mahogany launches and cedar strip runabouts, the hand-built Muskoka boats from the 20s through the 50s, back when a hull was planked by men who are all in the ground now. There are maybe a few dozen of us left in this country who can do it right, and we're getting fewer every winter because the old fellows who taught us are passing and the young ones, sensibly, go where the paycheck is. My dad ran a one-bay shop on a back road outside Gravenhurst, a gravel lot and a tin roof and a hand-lettered sign he repainted every couple of summers. Everything I know how to do, I learned with him leaning over my shoulder telling me I was doing it wrong. When I close my eyes over an open hull now, I'll be honest with you, half the time I can't tell whose hands are down there, his or mine. I work mostly alone, out of that same shop, which I bought back from the fellow my dad sold it to. I've got a daughter, Quinn. She's 16. Her mother, my wife, Nora, passed almost 4 years ago now. Cancer, the slow kind, the kind that gives you a year and a half to say everything and somehow leaves you certain you fumbled all of it. I won't sit you down in that with me. But I'll give you one thing, she said, because I carried it into that boathouse without even knowing it was riding along. Near the end, Nora watched me out the window one afternoon, replacing the front brakes on a neighbor's Civic in the driveway, because I couldn't stand to sit still in the house, and when I came in, she said, "You know, you'd rather lie on your back in the cold and fix anything with a bolt in it than sit on this bed and have one hard conversation with the people in your own kitchen." I told her that wasn't fair. She just gave me this little look, the one that said I'd understand her eventually, just probably too late for it to do either of us any good. She was right about that too. The call from the crane place came on a Wednesday in late April, right around ice out, when the lakes were just opening up black and cold and the boathouses were full of men taking the canvas off boats that had slept all winter. A lawyer's voice on the phone, smooth, patient, the kind that charges you in 15-minute blocks whether you talk to him or not. Mrs. Adelaide Crane had a vessel in need of restoration. A 1956 Grieving streamliner, mahogany, an inboard that hadn't run in some years. Several restorers had already had a go and failed. My name had come up through a collect down in Port Carling I'd done a transom for. Would I drive up and have a look? Everybody in cottage country knows the Crane name. Lumber money, then mining money, then the kind of must that's just money. The kind with a wing on the hospital in Toronto and a name carved over a library door and 3 generations of opinions about exactly who belongs at which dock. And I knew the name for one more reason, a private one I hadn't said out loud in 40 years, and didn't plan to start saying to a lawyer on the phone. I told him I'd come up Friday. The estate sat at the end of a long drive on the quiet side of Lake Rousseau, white pines 150 feet tall, the kind of place where the money's so old it's gone soft and gray and beautiful, held up by a small army of people you never see. Adelaide Crane met me down at the boathouse instead of the main house, which I understood for the small insult it was. You don't bring the help inside. She looked at my truck, then my boots, then my face, and I watched her arrive at a complete and permanent verdict on all three in about the time it takes to coil a dock line. That's when she said it. The thing about her daughter. The line about the proper sort. I understood the cruelty of it because I understood what she was really saying underneath. She was saying, "You are so far below this family that the most outlandish, impossible prize I can dangle in front of you is the idea of a man like you ever sitting near a woman like us." And the part she'd never know was that she'd swung that joke blind and caught me right across an old scar. Because the boy who used to hold the trouble light while his father reset the points on Edmund Crane's launch, that was me. I'd sat in that very boathouse on a milk crate 9-10 years old, listening to my dad and Mr. Crane talk engines while the loons called out on the lake. Adelaide never once looked at that boy. Why would she? To a woman like her, I had never been a person worth the trouble of remembering in the first place. "I'll take a look at the boat, ma'am," I said. I kept my voice level as a spirit bubble. "We'll talk about my rate once I know what I'm dealing with." 50. She blinked. I don't think she was used to a man answering as though the joke had simply not been told. Then she turned and walked me down into the boathouse without checking once to see if I was behind her. The streamliner sat in the slip under a fitted cover, and when I peeled it back, I felt the thing I always feel with these old boats, something close to tenderness which people find funny, and they can go right ahead. She was a beauty, mahogany the color of strong tea held up to a window, varnish gone milky in spots but the hull dead true, the chrome gone dull but all there. Up on the bow, hand-painted in gold leaf so fine you couldn't lay it with a machine, was her name, Wren. The water in the slip was glass still, and the boat sat low and patient in it the way a wooden boat does when it's been waiting, because that's all she was doing. These boats don't die on you, they wait. My husband loved this boat more than he loved most people in his life, Adelaide said from the doorway. I hadn't expected her to follow me in. She stood with her arms folded watching the boat and not me. "Edmund. He's been gone 6 years this spring. The boat stopped running within a month of the funeral as though it had decided to go with him. I've had 4 men try since. Real specialists. 1 out of Toronto, 2 from down on the St. Lawrence, 1 flown up from a club in the States. 50. They all told me the same ridiculous thing." Her voice tightened. "There is nothing mechanically wrong with it that they can find. And yet it will not run, as though the boat is simply refusing." She said that last part like it was an insult the boat had paid her personally, and now she was handing it down to me to see if I'd do any better. I didn't answer right off. I climbed down into the cockpit, into cracked leather that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and a man 6 years dead, and I put my hands on the wheel and I just sat there a minute, listening. There was nothing to hear, obviously, but my father taught me you listen first, before you ever pick up a wrench, because a boat'll tell you things if you give it enough quiet to talk in. 3 weeks, I said, climbing back out. I'll need her in my shop and I work with the doors shut. I don't like an audience. She named a number then. A big one, bigger than the job was worth by a good margin. And the way she named it told me everything. She was paying for a show. She fully expected me to lose, the same as the other 4, and she was pricing the entertainment of watching one more man get beaten by her dead husband's boat. I took the number anyway. I had my own reasons, and not one of them was the check. Now I have to tell you why I really took it, because without this part, none of the rest means a thing. 40-odd years ago, when I was a kid on that milk crate, Edmund Crane was the only man up on that lake who ever talked to my father like a man instead of like a contractor. The others would leave a key in an envelope and a note about what they wanted done, and never once shake his hand. Edmund used to come down to the boathouse with 2 bottles of Coke from the kitchen and sit on an overturned pail and ask my dad how a thing worked, and why he'd done it that way and not the other way. And he'd listen with his whole face, the way you do when you actually want the answer. One August afternoon he caught me eyeballing the bright work and he crouched down next to me, a man in pressed trousers, down on the dusty floor of his own boathouse, and he showed me how to read the grain in a plank, how the wood remembers every bit of weather it ever lived through, and he said a thing I've never forgotten. He said, "A boat that should float and won't isn't broken, son. It's keeping a secret. Your whole job is to be patient enough that it decides to trust you." I was maybe 10. I didn't know yet how right he'd turn out to be. So when Adelaide Crane stood on her steps and used her own daughter as the punchline of a joke about how far beneath them I was, she was, without the slightest idea she was doing it, insulting the only person in that whole gilded family who'd ever treated my father and me like we were worth the breath. I didn't take the job for the money. I didn't take it, really, even for the chance to humble her, though I won't pretend that wasn't in there somewhere, low down. I took it because the stubborn part of me, the part my father pressed into me along with everything else, wanted to stand in that family's boathouse and do the one thing all their money and all their certainty had never once been able to buy. I wanted to make Edmund Crane's boat sing again, for him. The first week, I did exactly what I figure the other 4 did. You start with the obvious: fuel, ignition, electrical, the whole spine of the thing. And the more I went over it, the stranger it got, because that boat was magnificent. Edmund had cared for her with real love right up to the month he died. The wiring was sound, the insulation still supple, no rot in the harness, no rodents. I pulled the plugs and they were clean. The compression came up strong and even across all 6 cylinders, the numbers of an engine with plenty of life left in it. There was spark. There was fuel in the tank, old but not turned to varnish. By every measurement I knew how to take, and I know a great many, that boat should have caught on the second turn of the key. And she wouldn't so much as cough. This is the wall the other 4 hit. I understood why. You get to the edge of what you can explain, you write intermittent fault, unable to replicate on your invoice, you bill for the diagnostic time, and you drive home to easier work. There's no shame in it, exactly, but I kept hearing my dad in the back of my skull, and I kept hearing Edmund crouched on that boathouse floor 40 years gone. A boat that should float and won't is keeping a secret. So I stopped trying to start her. That was the whole trick, and it took me the better part of a week to remember it. I quit attacking the problem, and I started listening to the boat. I spent 2 full days doing nothing but tracing every system by hand, slow, the way you'd read a long letter from somebody you loved, following each line end to end and feeling for the spot where the story quit making sense. And on the 3rd day, down low and forward, my fingers found the wrong note. The fuel line ran through a shutoff valve, and somebody had been at it. Not broken it, set it, adjusted it with care and skill so it sat almost, but not quite, open. Fuel would seem to be available and yet never quite arrive, in a way you would never catch by testing components, because no single part was faulty. They were all in perfect order. They'd just been quietly told to work against one another. I sat back on my heels and felt the hair come up on my arms, because here's a thing I know all the way down in my spine after 30 years. There is a world of difference between a part that has failed and a part that has been set. A failure is just the universe wearing a thing down the way it wears everything down. But this was a choice. Somebody had reached into this boat and, gently and expertly, made certain she'd never run again, and done it in a way that would read to any honest mechanic who didn't know her intimately as a ghost. A phantom fault, a boat being difficult on purpose, and there was exactly one man on God's earth who'd known this boat well enough to do that, and he'd died the same month she went quiet. Edmund Crane had disabled his own beloved boat, on purpose, with his own hands, as one of the last things he ever did. I sat with that a long while, down in the cold of the hull, and then I went hunting for the why of it, because a man does not stop the heart of the thing he loves most for nothing. He does it as a message, and I'd already been told this boat was trying to say something. So I followed the fuel line back, past where any normal repair would ever take you, to an access panel under the engine box that doesn't come off in ordinary service. And it had come off recently in the life of a 6-year dead boat. The screws were clean where everything around them was filmed gray with grease. Somebody had been in there last and closed it up and meant for it to stay shut until the right person came along to open it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a flat tin about the size of a paperback, tucked into a cavity that had been deliberately cleared to take it, was a letter. I want to be straight with you about what I did next, because the easy thing, the thing most men would do, is carry it up to the big house and hand it to the widow and pocket your thanks. But across the top of that tin, in faded fountain pen ink, in a careful old-fashioned hand, was a name. And the name wasn't Adelaide. The name was Wren. I knelt there with the tin in my 2 greasy hands and felt 40 years rearrange themselves around me in the dark, because all at once I understood what Edmund Crane had done. Wren was the boat. But I had a feeling, standing in that hull, that Wren had been somebody before she was ever a boat. He'd hidden a letter inside the one object on the lake that he knew his family would never sell and would never, ever be able to open on their own. He'd locked it inside a machine that only a true craftsman would ever be able to reach. Because to find it, you'd have to love the boat enough and know her well enough to follow her silence all the way down to this one hidden place. And to make dead certain that someday someone would have to dig this deep, he'd reached in and stopped her from running. The boat wasn't broken. She was a strong box, and the dead engine was the lock, and the key wasn't a tool at all. It was a kind of person. I did not open that letter. I want you to know that. I held a dead man's last words in my hands, alone, with nobody watching, and I put the lid back on, because some things aren't yours no matter who finds them, but I knew I couldn't give it to Adelaide either, because it wasn't hers. That evening I drove back out to the estate and found her in a glassed-in room off the main house with a view down the lawn to the water, and I asked her, as gently as I knew how, whether she had a daughter. The question went through her like a current. Her face did something complicated and put it away fast. "Sylvie," she said at last, very upright. "She's out in Vancouver. We aren't close." A pause that visibly cost her. "We haven't spoken in some years." "Since Mr. Crane passed?" I asked. "Before that," she said, and turned to look out the window at the pines, and in the set of her shoulders I read the whole truth of it, that whatever ran through this family was old, older than Edmund's death, that the old man had died inside the crack of it, and that nothing had healed in all the years since. I told her, careful as diffusing a thing, that I'd found something in the boat that belonged to her daughter, and that I felt strongly it should go to Sylvie directly, from my hand to hers. Adelaide's first instinct was the instinct of a woman who'd spent 76 years controlling everything she could reach. She put out her hand, palm up, an old habit of command. I didn't put it there. I stood in her beautiful glass room and I said, as respectfully as I had it in me to say, that her husband had hidden this where only the Restoration itself could ever find it, with her daughter's name on it in his own hand, and that I believed with everything in me that he'd meant it to travel to Sylvie by exactly this road and no other, and that I was not going to be the man who overruled the last careful plan a dying man ever made. I was sure she'd fire me where I stood. For a long, cold moment those pale eyes held on me, and I waited for it. And then something in them gave a hairline, the kind of crack I spend my whole life finding in old wood and old steel. She lowered her hand. "He called her Wren," she said. The thing I keep coming back to is how close I came to driving off that property and never knowing any of it. Adelaide Crane stood on those boathouse steps and decided in 4 seconds flat exactly what I was worth, and the easy thing, the thing nobody would have blamed me for, was to take the insult and go home. But the choice I made instead set everything after it in motion. I stayed because of one principle my father handed me along with his tools, the same principle that made me refuse to open a letter that wasn't mine and refuse to hand it to anybody but the person whose name was on it. You don't get to skip the part where you do the right thing just because it costs you something. Edmund Crane learned that the hard way, and he died still paying for the years he stayed quiet to keep the peace. I didn't want to be a man who learned it that late. But doing right wasn't enough on its own, and I want to be honest about that. 4 good men had stood over that boat before me, and none of them were short on skill. What they were short on was patience, the willingness to stop forcing the thing and get quiet enough to actually hear what it was telling them. That's a kind of smarts that has nothing to do with school. It's the difference between looking and seeing. The fault Edmund set wasn't hidden from better tools. It was hidden from impatient men, and the only reason I found it is that somewhere around the 3rd day, I quit trying to win and started trying to understand. Most of the real problems in a life work exactly the same way. And then there's the part that nobody can do for you, which is the long, cold stretch in the middle when the boat won't run and the check feels like charity. And a voice in your head says go home, same as the others. You sit in that, and you keep your hands moving anyway, and you trust the work, even when the work isn't talking back yet. That stubbornness is the only reason any of the rest of it happened. Here's what it cost me to figure out, and what I'd hand to Quinn if I could only hand her one thing. The boat ran in the end because I did the right thing, thought harder than the men before me, and refused to quit on it. But the conversation at my own kitchen table had been sitting there the whole time, needing the exact same 3 things from me, and I'd been too proud to give them. I treated a phone call to my own kid like the hardest repair on earth. It wasn't. It was just the one I was afraid of. The boats were never the hard part. The boats were where I hid from the hard part, and the day I stopped hiding was the day I finally got my daughter back.